Now, before anybody starts imagining Labradors wandering around the living room completely intoxicated, it's important to make a distinction. These compounds are very different from the THC, which is the psychoactive component associated with the high from cannabis. Welcome to The Consult Room, the podcast where we explore the evolving world of modern pet care. I'm Dr Paul Manktelow, a UK veterinary surgeon with a deep passion for pet health and welfare. In each episode, I'll be exploring key issues, challenging perspectives, and offering expert insight and practical advice. Because ultimately, my mission is to improve the lives of pets and the people who love them. Today, we're talking about CBD and CBG products for pets. Now, if you've spent any time online recently, you'll probably have seen that these products are popping up everywhere. Now, they're marketed for everything from arthritis and chronic pain through to anxiety and age-related decline. Now, depending on who you ask, they're either one of the most exciting developments in pet healthcare or they're little more than expensive marketing. And that's exactly why I wanted to explore this topic. Because the truth is there's a lot of noise, a lot of opinions, and a lot of confusion. So in this episode, I want to take a step back and ask a few simple questions. What are CBD and CBG? Why are so many pet owners interested in them? What does the science actually say? And perhaps most importantly, where do we separate genuine potential from wishful thinking? As always, this isn't about telling you what to think. It's about understanding the evidence, understanding the uncertainties, and helping you make sense of an area that's evolving very quickly. Let's start with the basics. CBD or cannabidiol and CBG or cannabigerol are naturally occurring compounds found within the cannabis plant. Now, before anybody starts imagining Labradors wandering around the living room completely intoxicated, it's important to make a distinction. These compounds are very different from the THC, which is the psychoactive component associated with the high from cannabis. CBD and CBG don't produce that effect. Instead, interest in these compounds comes from the way they interact with something called the endocannabinoid system. And that's where things become genuinely fascinating because humans have an endocannabinoid system, dogs have an endocannabinoid system, and cats have an endocannabinoid system. Now, it's involved in regulating a huge range of biological functions, including pain, inflammation, appetite, mood, sleep, and immune responses. So there is a biologically plausible reason why these compounds might have therapeutic effects. But here's the first key point. Just because something makes sense biologically doesn't automatically mean it works clinically. And that's where the science becomes important. Before we get into the research, though, I think it's worth asking a different question. Why are so many pet guardians so interested in these products in the first place? Because most people aren't buying CBD because they're fascinated by the cannabinoid receptors. They're buying it because they're trying to help their pet. Maybe they've got an older pet that's becoming stiff and slowing down. Maybe they've got a dog that struggles every bonfire night. Or maybe they're caring for a pet with a chronic condition and they're looking for something that might help. And that's where cannabinoids have found a really receptive audience. Now, they're often marketed as natural, they're widely available online, and they're accompanied by countless positive testimonials. But here's a statement that's worth remembering through this entire discussion. Anecdotes are not evidence. It doesn't mean that those stories are wrong. It simply means we have to be careful not to confuse personal experiences with scientific proof. So what does the science actually tell us? Well, perhaps surprisingly, there is one area where the evidence looks genuinely encouraging, and that's osteoarthritis and chronic pain. Several studies have shown improvements in mobility, activity levels, and owner-assessed comfort in dogs receiving CBD products. Now, if you're an older dog with arthritis, you'll immediately understand why that gets people excited, because even modest improvements in comfort and mobility can have a huge impact on quality of life. But before we get carried away, it's really important to keep things in perspective. Many of these studies involve relatively small numbers of dogs. Different products have been used, different doses have been used, and follow-up periods are often quite short. So whilst the findings are encouraging, we're not yet looking at the same depth of evidence that supports many licensed veterinary medicines. One of the biggest surprises for me when researching this episode was that the strongest evidence for CBD in dogs isn't actually anxiety, it's arthritis and chronic pain. Now, that's interesting because if you look online, anxiety is probably one of the main reasons people are buying these products. So there's already a gap between what owners are most interested in and where the science is actually strongest. But arthritis isn't the only condition researchers have been investigating. Another area attracting attention is epilepsy. Early studies suggest CBD may reduce seizure frequency in some dogs when used alongside conventional anti-epileptic medication. Again, that's really exciting. If you've ever lived with an epileptic dog, you'll appreciate why any potential new option generates interest. But again, the story is nuanced. Not every dog responds. The studies are relatively small, and we're still a long way from recommending cannabinoids as a replacement for established epilepsy treatments. At the moment, they remain an area of interest rather than a standard of care. Now, this is where I think the conversation starts to get slightly ahead of the evidence, because if you ask pet guardians why they're buying CBD, one of the most common answers you'll hear is anxiety, firework fears, travel stress, separation-related problems, general nervousness. The demand is clearly there, but when you look at the research, the picture becomes much less convincing. There are some encouraging early findings, but the evidence remains limited and inconsistent. Thousands of pet guardians are buying CBD products for firework fears, travel stress, and separation anxiety. The problem is that when you actually look at the scientific evidence, it's nowhere near as strong as many people assume. That doesn't mean CBD doesn't help some dogs. It means the marketing and the demand have moved faster than the science. And that's important because sometimes the conditions generating the biggest consumer demand are not necessarily the conditions supported by the strongest scientific evidence. And then there's another cannabinoid that's beginning to appear more frequently in products, CBG. Now, if I'm honest, this is where I become even more cautious. Not because I think it lacks potential, but because we simply know much less about it. There are laboratory studies suggesting anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective effects. There are some genuinely interesting hypotheses. But when it comes to veterinary patients, the evidence base remains very limited. So whilst the marketing is accelerating rapidly, the science is still catching up. And that's a theme you will hear repeatedly throughout this episode. Of course, none of that matters if the products aren't safe. Now, one of the assumptions I sometimes hear is that because something is natural, it must automatically be safe. Unfortunately, that's not how biology works. Many natural substances can be harmful. Many synthetic medicines can be beneficial, and vice versa. But the word natural tells us very little about either the safety or effectiveness. The good news is that CBD appears to have a relatively favorable safety profile at the doses studied so far. The most commonly reported side effects include sedation, gastrointestinal upset, and changes in liver enzyme values. Most of these appear mild, but they still reinforce the importance of veterinary oversight, particularly if a pet is already receiving other medications. Because whenever we introduce a new product, we also have to think about the interactions. But perhaps the biggest issue isn't effectiveness. It isn't even safety. For me, the biggest concern wasn't whether CBD works. It was whether the product you're buying contains what it says on the label. Studies have found some products contain more CBD than advertised, some contain less, and some have even contained detectable levels of THC. So before we even talk about whether CBD works, we have to be confident we know what's in the bottle. And this is where things become challenging. And that's a genuine concern. Because if product quality varies significantly, it becomes very difficult to compare results, draw conclusions, or make informed decisions. When someone says a CBD product worked brilliantly for their dog, one of the first questions we should be asking is, which product, what concentration, and what quality controls were in place? And those details really matter. And then we arrive at what is probably the most confusing part of the entire conversation, the law. The legal position in the UK is far more complicated than many people would realise. The Veterinary Medicines Directorate considers products containing CBD intended for use in animals to fall within the definition of a veterinary medicine. At the same time, there are currently no widely available authorized veterinary CBD medicines routinely available in the market. And that creates a really difficult situation. Consumer demand is growing, scientific interest is growing, yet regulation is still evolving. One of the most confusing things about CBD in pets is that many people assume that if a product is easy to buy online, it must be fully approved for use in animals. Now, for pet guardians, that can be incredibly confusing. And for veterinary professionals, it can be equally challenging because the questions are often arriving faster than the answers. So after reading the research, where have I landed on all of this? Well, actually somewhere in the middle. After looking at the evidence, I don't think CBD is a miracle cure for pets, but I don't think it's snake oil either. What I think is that we're looking at an area with genuine scientific potential, particularly around pain and inflammation, but one where the marketing has often moved faster than the evidence. And that's why this is such an interesting topic. For me, that's the key takeaway. We shouldn't dismiss cannabinoids simply because they're new, but neither should we embrace them uncritically simply because they're popular. Good medicine sits between those two extremes. It asks difficult questions and it demands evidence. And it remains willing to change position when better evidence emerges. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is this. CBD and CBG may become important tools in veterinary medicine. The science is certainly interesting enough to justify further research, but we're not yet at the point where they can be viewed as magic bullets. There are still unanswered questions around effectiveness, dosing, long-term safety, quality control, and regulation. And until the science catches up with the marketing, curiosity should probably be accompanied by a healthy dose of caution. Thank you for listening to this episode. You'll find all the relevant links to this conversation in the show notes. If you enjoyed it, please follow us and leave a review. It really helps other people discover the podcast. For more insights on topics like this, you can connect with me on social media at Dr Paul the Vet, or check out my website, theconsultroom.co.uk.